The next morning, while brushing her horses down, Sophie asked, "Dad, do you remember any of the tourist sites on the trail?" "Hun, I recall nothing about the trail. I remembered how to get here, and that's it." "Would you like to see a couple sites?" "Sure, that'd be great. Let's take transport. We could ride, but that would take too long." Sophia called for transport. The site she planned to visit was one she designed herself. Each rancher in Fernwood was given 40 square miles to design and build a site of their choosing, somewhere within the boundaries of trail. Since most of the people living in Fernwood boarded horses, they hoped it would add to the experience of the riders. I was taken back when we pulled up to a well-constructed ghost town, including tumbleweeds. The city sign was placed atop a crossbeam attached to 2 wooden poles. It read, "Welcome to Sophia." We both laughed. "You don't remember this, Dad?" "Sorry, hun, I don't, but it looks amazing. This is one of 5 towns I have designed and built within my 40-mile allotment." The town looked hundreds of years old. Half the windows were broken, and a few doors hung halfway off their hinges. Several tumbleweeds were making their way down a dusty street. I could smell the dust. She showed me around to the various saloons, hotels, and city offices, every one of them authentic. We moseyed into one saloon called the Santa Fe. As we entered, a companion, stood up from behind the bar and asked us if we wanted to eat or order a drink. We both requested sarsaparilla. Sophie informed me it was the most famous drink on the trail. "It's always the simple things that remain, Dad. This town, although a ghost town, is entirely functional. Visitors can stay in the hotels, eat at the diners, saloons, buy trail grub, and other desired items. It even includes a gift shop for those who want to remember their experience." As we entered, if you noticed, there was a blacksmith shop to the left with a couple of dozen stalls to board horses overnight. I noticed that. It looked authentic. It is authentic. The building came right out of the early 1800s. Wow. We picked out 2 cowboy hats, walked over to the sheriff's office, and took up residence in 2 rocking chairs out front. We sat for a while as the town filled up with trail riders. Several stopped to ask us for directions or information, which Sophie answered without missing a beat. Of course, she knew the area well. Just as she finished giving directions to a group of riders, we heard a thunderous sound of hoofbeats coming from our right side. A group of cowboys came riding full throttle through town. They rode up to the saloon we were just in, dismounted, and entered. I looked at Sophie, questioning. "Don't worry, Daddy, those cowboys are part of the experience. They're a group of companions who ride into town regularly to add to the excitement of the tourists. I wanted to make it as authentic as possible. Wait for the shootout, Father." As we continued to talk, I kept an eye on the saloon, expecting someone or something to come flying out the swinging front doors at any moment. "Dad, when the town is empty, people have to use their imagination of how it was back in the era of an old western town. Out of the corner of your eye, you might see a shadow, a reflection in a window of someone moving around, a child laughing or crying, with so many eerie little things the imagination can conjure up. This little ghost town will cater to anyone." 2 minutes later a stagecoach came racing through town. The whole town stopped to look as it pulled up to the stage office. That stagecoach is one of 16 that travel between the 5 towns I've created. 4 of the towns are at each of the corners, and 1 town, actually a fort, is built in the center. Anyone who wishes can ride the coach to any of the other 4 towns. It takes 4 hours to travel to one of the corner towns by stagecoach, and 2 hours from each corner location to travel to Fort Myer, which is the fort in the center of the site. Except for the Fort Myer run, it stops halfway to change horses and allow passengers to eat. You can turn around at each checkpoint, but either way, the outside trip is at least a 6-hour commitment by stagecoach. She stood and motioned me to follow her, and said, "Let's walk to the other end of town. I want to show you something else." It took 20 minutes to walk to the other end. Once there, Sophie pointed out 2 sets of railroad tracks. Not only was there a stagecoach line, but 6 trains also traveled to and from each town. As we walk up to the boarding platform, a clerk came out of the station and stood beside us. The station had 2 boarding platforms, one on either side of the tracks for those traveling in different directions. The clerk drew out and looked at his pocket watch. The train should be here in 5 minutes. Are you folks traveling today? Sophie answered, No, I'm showing my dad the town, maybe another time. Okay, miss. Sophie, no problem, maybe next time. I heard the whistle blow off in the distance. I said, I would like to wait for the train to arrive at the terminal. Okay, let's wait. 5 minutes later we saw the train off in the distance, coming around the bend. Sophie explained the tracks were not just 4 straight lines between each town, but they zigzagged through the forest, waterways, and mountains, as she pointed to a small mountain range to the south. The train pulled into the station. It was a magnificent rendition of an old steam locomotive. It looked perfectly restored, and was pulling 3 passenger cars, 2 private cars, and a caboose attached to the end. I immediately thought of art. I asked, Is this train original? Yes, it is. I grabbed my chin as I put 2 and 2 together, but said nothing about where the trains came from. Art was involved in this somehow? We stood in place as passengers disembarked. The train won't leave the station for another hour, providing travelers the time to board. We entered a small restaurant inside the train terminal and decided to order lunch. I wanted to stay until the train left the station. 4 passengers boarded the train while we sat eating lunch, a father, mother, and 2 children. The whistle blew a long, loud blast and was off. I asked, Are the other towns a replica of this one, Ethan? No, each one has its own personality. We are at the northeast corner. The northwest corner is an old early 1800s Mexican town, with villas. The one in the southwest corner is a mid-1700s San Francisco, called Cisco. No real cowboys there. The southeast corner is an early 1700s Boston, no real cowboys there either. Then, there's Fort Myer in the middle of everything. Dad, I was trying to cover the early years of the West. Then she asked, You know what I found interesting? What, Ian? Many people who live in Cisco and Boston were actual people who lived in those places back in the 17 and 1800s. I'm amazed by the number of people who asked me if they could live there. Apparently, they missed the era. Most of them were quite helpful in constructing those cities, having lived in them. I know, Honorable, it is the same on Prairie where such places also exist. Isn't it amazing? Yes, it is. I couldn't say no to them. Well, I guess it makes it more authentic. Yes, it does, Daddy. My daughter's imagination was staggering. It boggled my mind considering the details she put into the town. I became eager to see what the other residents of Fernwood did with their own sites. All the residents of Fernwood were immortals. So, I predicted nothing less than mind-blowing creations from each of them. Sophie and I were ready to go riding. So, we returned to the ranch to saddle up Map and Sage, the buckskin, Sophie's favorite horse. She said, I know a place that would be a fun ride. Would it be all right if we go there? Lead the way, sweetheart. She called for transport, which could carry 2 horses. It dropped us off on a wide trail that looked as if it was more than just for horseback riders. It was more of a dirt road. It was hilly, and it wound in and out of those hills. Sophie told me we're a little more than halfway across trail. Our ride proved downright lazy as we took our time crossing several creeks, a couple of prairies, and a wild apple orchard. We dismounted and allowed the horses to stray and eat a few apples from off the trees and ground. Afterward, we had to push them to get moving again. As evening came, we stopped alongside a creek to catch 2 rainbow trout. We started a fire, cooked our fish, and then settled in for the night. Sophie fell asleep instantly, while I laid looking up at several small moons in front of a dense field of stars until I fell asleep too. We woke early, ate a couple of trail bars, packed up, and were on our way. The trail brought us through a thicket of bushes, which opened to a dock on a large lake. The lake was at the base of the Castle Mountain range. We could not proceed any further by horseback. Sophie explained we need to board a ferry to take us to the other side of the lake. I asked, what's the lake called? It's called 3-Day Lake. It takes 3 days, by ferry, to get to the other side. While looking around, I noticed several people waiting for the ferry to arrive. I noticed 3 small docks down the beach, which moored at least 30 fishing boats and yachts. I imagined owning one of those yachts. I asked, Hun, when does the ferry get here? Sophie continued, it comes later in the afternoon. So, the one due today hasn't come yet, so we're lucky we won't have to spend the night and tomorrow waiting for the next one. When Sophie told me, it took 3 days to cross the lake, I thought how wonderful I didn't have to be anywhere. It gave me the laziest feeling I have ever had. Also, whenever I did something, I did it without any time-related worry. There were no places I needed to be, or important responsibilities getting in my way. It was a nice guiltless pleasure. As we waited for the ferry, I contacted Keith and persuaded him to join us. He said he could meet us in 2 hours. Sophie contacted her foreman and had another horse with gear delivered to us for him. The ferry wasn't expected for another 4 hours, which turned out to be perfect timing. Once Keith arrived, we hugged each other. While we waited, Keith filled us in on his current project. He was a photographer, editor, and writer. He published and wrote articles for the Sierran, the major publication in Sierra. Despite the current technical age, magazines had made a comeback. Like a marvelous fad, the population was returning to the written word such as books and magazines. Personally, I believed that happened because of the pictures. Unlike the camera, most electronic media can't produce equally beautiful printed pictures like the modern-day presses can. Keith was like a watcher, but for a different reason. Notably, his articles in the Sierran covered the section of people, places, and things. Therefore, like a watcher, he observes people and situations as he traveled around Sierra writing articles about people, places, and things. Could I be more redundant? Keith said an article about the ferry trip might make for good reading. Sophie and I agreed only because it brought him on the trip with us. The ferry arrived an hour after Keith did. Wow! It looked like a brand new cruise ship. When you think of a ferry, you imagine a small craft with a few spaces to park vehicles, like cars, even though there were none. Fortunately, the dock could easily handle a ship like this one. After mooring, the ferry dropped a section, an elevator, onto the dock. Everyone entered there. Once inside, the deckhands directed us to a spot on the cargo deck designed like a barn with at least 50 stalls and feed for the horses. It only made sense based on the purpose of the ship. After putting the horses into the stalls, we strolled up on deck to the register's office to get berths. The 3 of us were assigned cabins next to one another. My cabin was extravagant and comfortable, although I would not have predicted to see such accommodations on a ferry. It reminded me of an expensive yacht or cruise ship. The middle of my berth contained an inviting king-size bed next to a spacious sitting area and kitchenette. The bath was oversized and introduced a big brass and tile shower. According to Sophie, all the cabins were similar. The ferry stayed at the dock until the next morning. That allowed time for anyone close enough to board. Sophie said, "Well, that's new. In the past the ship only stayed in port for 3 hours. I guess that's better for passengers who might be running late." We made our way to the top deck. Both forward and aft of the ferry was open for viewing the scenery. Each end had small restaurants open 24 hours a day. We parked at a small outdoor table and ordered an early dinner. Keith pulled out his camera and took pictures, and we smiled for him. All I can report was once the ferry got underway, my vocabulary became 3 expressions: wow, look, amazing. The lake stretched 215 miles, and up to a half-mile wide. Mountains enclosed both sides. Those mountains often protruded straight up out of the water to heights of 5,000 feet or even higher. Most were snow-capped, with crescent valleys in between, and full of abundant wildlife. Many of the valleys contained rivers that ran from October Bay to the lake, delivering many species of fish that spawn along the rivers or in the lake. The bears were particularly fascinating as hundreds of brown bears fished in those rivers as they cascaded down into the lake. All the ferries came to a stop 2 hours and moored each day for a short period so passengers could fish. The crew offered fishing gear so anyone interested could do so. Once it came to a stop, a platform lowered from the stern down to the water. They designed it so the fishermen could stand on it to fish close to the water. 3-Day Lake was popular for fishermen wanting to catch the 300-pound sockeye salmon it offered. The crew encouraged and accommodated anyone interested in hooking one. Keith took pictures as we made our way down to the fishing platform. Since the ferry kept any unwanted fish, we tested our luck. I wasn't interested in keeping the fish, but wanted to catch one. The first one caught was always the most exciting, especially when Keith was the first to catch one. It weighed in at 220 pounds. Next, a man from Commerce caught a 250-pounder. It took both of them 20 minutes to get their catch onto the boat. It was impressive how they both worked the lines to keep the fish from tangling with other lines. As soon as they brought them in, a woman in the group hooked one. Most who tried fishing caught a fish except Sophie and me, but it was fun watching the others pull in their catches. Eventually, the ferry got back underway after granting the customary 2 hours of fishing. They caught 14 sockeye salmon during that brief period, none under 200 pounds. Sockeye was the best salmon for smoking. When I asked one of the other fishermen what they planned to do with their fish, he said he intended to smoke it, as I expected. The ferry provided a galley for those who wanted to keep their catch, so the fish could be cleaned and cut in whatever preparation the person hoped. Smokers were accessible at either dock to smoke their fish. The dock crew stored it until the owner came back for it, or they shipped it to the fisherman's address. The dock workers were quite experienced at smoking the fish. As the three of us stood on the observation deck, we spotted several boats, long-line fishing boats with their lines dropped into the lake. Keith told us the names on most of the boats were of particular seafood restaurants. Right after informing us, we passed 2 floating platforms with the same names and with several of the fishing boats tied up unloading their catch. Several transport vehicles sat ready to carry that catch off somewhere else, evidently to those same restaurants. At night, the main lounge offered movies with sodas and popcorn. We inquired if they had any of the adventure movies, one of Jesse's in particular. The media center didn't have adventure videos on board, but not an obstacle. The media officer had it beamed in. So, we entertained ourselves with an adventure movie and Jesse in the leading role. Honestly, we got the chance to laugh, but overall, it was well done, and I was impressed with him. Of course, I was. Maybe, I'll give it another try. After the movie, we went to bed. Except for Keith, who stayed up through the night writing and going over his photos. He told us the next morning how he could generate more interest in this trip as he planned to write an article for the magazine. Also, he expected to send a video crew to take the trip for a video documentary. We ended up spending 3 nights on the ferry because the other passengers convinced the captain to spend most of the next day fishing, putting us behind schedule. The captain could do so per his discretion, and we didn't disagree, so the captain allowed it. Apparently, the other riders on board were avid fishermen. We arrived at our destination early in the morning on the 4th day. I slept in because when I woke, the other group of riders had already left. It was my transgression, as I didn't want to get out of bed and took my time getting up and ready. As we disembarked, Sophie got in contact with her head ranch hand about the youngster she was training. At the same time, Keith contacted his secretary at the magazine. He was delivering a list of items he required when he got back. Consequently, I was left standing by myself. So, I pulled out a brush from the saddlebags to brush Map. As I brushed him, I saw at the end of the dock was a small building. Behind that same building stood a high brick wall with a precarious opening in the middle. Once the kids finished with their communications, we walked past the building and through the narrow opening in the wall. Surprisingly, I was taken back when we passed through the opening. We came out in a South American jungle. The wall we came through sat high up on a hill, and turned out to be the entrance to a long tropical valley. On either side rose 2 high mountains which protected the lake from overflowing into the jungle below us, although a small river sprung out from the base of one of the mountains in the form of a waterfall. It ran right through the middle of the city below us. We stopped to look down on a scene right out of the history books. Several ancient buildings reached up out of the jungle. My initial thoughts included the Incas or the Mayans. We saw an open area in the center of a group of the buildings glistening in the sun. We headed for that spot. As we approached, I noticed the buildings we passed shined like gold as the sunlight fell on them. I instantly recalled my dream with my kids in the field. I thought to myself, was this that same city in my dream? No, it couldn't be. People were traveling in both directions on the path. Eventually, we emerged out of the jungle into an open-air market. It was packed with vendors selling various kinds of fruit, vegetables, meats, and smoked fish. After looking around, I said, shouldn't this city be on another planet? It looks like one of the historical communities designated for prairie. Sophie answered, not again, Dad. No, this is another site designed by a local resident of Fernwood. It was constructed by my friend Eric. Okay, Honorable, I conceded. Then I said, wow, far out. I looked at her and smiled. Keith took pictures without saying a thing. He was anxious to get an article out. We, with horses in tow, walked around the city. It was definitely a skillful creation of an ancient Mayan civilization, without the malicious false gods or human sacrifices. I was upbeat about that, even though it was not completely accurate. Many of the characters weren't companions, but actual people, notably the vendors. I asked one vendor, why would you want to live like this? He answered, I don't. This is my job. I come to work every day and go home every night, and I have been doing so for over 90 years. Are you of Mayan descent? Yes, I am, he answered. Just then a group of kids came up asking for dried papaya. It looked to be pure sugar to me. He yelled, then laughed at the kids. I laughed with them too. Ignoring the little deprived voice in my head, I appealed for the same dried papaya. I'm positive it was quite healthy, so I ate it as I made my way back to Sophie and Keith, who advanced down the street. I paid attention to the interaction between that vendor and the other vendors around him. They respected each other as close friends. Now, I understood why he enjoyed working in a setting like this. As I caught up with the kids, I mentioned how this place was a wonderful surprise. We walked around town for the whole day, looking at the tall buildings, pyramids, and small family dwellings. The shops were full of trinkets, statues, and painted artwork was displayed everywhere. The city was packed with people. Even though most of the natives were companions, you couldn't tell. It was so natural how they interacted with the tourists. In the early evening, we took up a spot close outside the city. Camping spots were created for riders to camp overnight before heading into the jungle. Keith spent most of the night writing and going over his pictures, again. We harassed him until he quit and joined us around the campfire. The next day we mounted our horses and headed out. The trail was wide as a road, with dense jungle on both sides of us. On the one side we could hear the constant soft sound of the river as it flowed away from the mountain. Here and there, we saw parts of old ruins through the jungle. We pretended we were the first explorers ever to come upon them. Occasionally, the jungle opened up next to a lake or meadow. By early afternoon, the jungle gave way to a less dense terrain, more forest than jungle. Sophie explained that Eric's site was only 42 miles square. Even though each resident had 40 miles of land to create their site, Eric's ran slightly over, but no one complained. He did a remarkable job creating it, and it looked authentic. I asked Sophie, are all the sites as striking as this? Dad, I showed you my site first. Oh hun, I didn't mean to sound as if Eric's site was any better than yours. Your ghost town was every bit, in every detail, as wonderful as this site. I was only surprised to find his city here on Cedar. She didn't act bothered by it, but I sensed I might have hurt her feelings. The last thing I'd ever want to do was hurt my kids' feelings. It was okay to get mad at them, but don't maliciously hurt them. She retorted slowly and deliberately, yes, father, every site is equally stunning. Keith had his face in his camera. With every intention of interrupting him, I asked, "Did you hear that, son?" "What? Did I hear what?" "Never mind." The forest opened to a valley, full of rocks, little ones, medium ones, and tall statue-looking ones which stood 30 to 40 feet high, in the middle of nowhere. Most of those pillars looked like sandstone. All of them were worn down by the elements. I loved rocks. I loved rock hounding. Unconsciously, I stopped and dismounted Map to have a look at the ones that fit into my hand. Among the rocks, I found several gold nuggets. Obviously, I picked a couple up only to toss them back, being more interested in finding thunder eggs so I could crack them open to see what type of crystals were hidden within. During my mining expedition, I found 2 large thunder eggs and put them in my saddlebags to take back with me. I could plan a whole trip to go rock hounding, even several trips. We traveled over rocky terrain for the rest of the day. The sun got hot during the late afternoon. So, we stopped to sit in the shade of a group of tall sandstone pillars and built a camp right there. I noticed scorpions running around and under the rocks. So, we slept in hammocks to avoid any creepy crawlies, with one eye open. We tied our beds to ancient Jacob trees that were close enough to tie the ropes. I got up early in the morning and built a fire to make coffee because it was chilly, almost too cold. When Sophie and Keith got up, we talked about our plans for the day. The 3 of us were ready to end the trip. We took the time to drink our coffee and eat breakfast before we left. I felt compelled to go home. Keith called for transport first. We hugged him before he left and then called for transport for ourselves and 3 horses. When we returned to Sophie's, we immediately went into her little barn to put the horses in their stalls. She wanted to check up on her other ones. I patted Map and hugged his neck. I didn't know when I would see him next. As we were finishing up, Sophie's lead ranch hand came into the barn. He asked Sophie, "Do you want to take in 3 more boarders? We need to open another barn to do so." "Are the owners in a hurry?" "No, none of them had purchased horses yet." "Ask me tomorrow, and I'll have an answer then." Late that afternoon, we hugged each other, said our goodbyes, and I left. While going home, I thought about my kids all the way. It was wonderful to know our children are exactly right for us. How could anyone imagine having other children than the ones we have to be our own? I can't even explain how it happens. I'm grateful it does. Because of such a perfect phenomenon, I understood how important it was to lead them to Christ. I refuse to imagine one day in heaven without them. That would be impossible.